Well, good to see all of you here tonight. So I guess I'll go ahead with my presentation then.
Well, hold on, we're going to introduce you.
Oh,
And,
okay.
and should everybody, if they might want to go to speaker view, so when he shows slides, they're bigger.
Oh, okay.
Oh, and here, let me make sure you are a co-host so you can share your screen. All right, well, welcome everyone. It's 7:01, so as we say, of course, we always want to start on time. And thank you everyone for coming. So we're very excited for this presentation to hear, to hear from Sam, but we are also celebrating tonight the holiday of Tu B'Shvat, literally just meaning the 15th of the month of Shvat, but actually is considered to be the new year of the trees. Now, of course, if we look outside in Chicago, none of our trees really are starting to bloom. It's actually pretty snowy. But in the land of Israel right now, in that kind of whole region, those trees are starting to bud right around this time. But in any event, one of the things that this holiday teaches us is that we need, of course, to be good stewards of our environment. And we need to be able to celebrate and also protect our natural environment that is around us. So with that, I'm actually going to invite up Rick Schoenfeld, who is going to introduce Sam.
Hi, and welcome everybody on behalf of the Congregation's Environmental Task Force. We're really glad to see you here. We're also very glad to have Sam Cox as our speaker. Sam grew up in the temple. His mom is a member and is online. And Sam is actually the newest member of the Congregation's Environmental Task Force. And very importantly and significantly, he is an arborist for the village of Lombard. So I don't think he needs any further introduction, and I'll turn it over to Sam.
All right, well, it's good to be here with everyone. Good to be talking about a very important subject that is relevant to all of us, given that it's Tu B'Shvat. So I will begin my presentation, and if anyone who is sitting on this call currently has any questions at any point in time, if you could please just send them to me in the chat box, and if I have a time later on, I'll be able to address them at the end of the presentation. So. Just trying to figure out how to share my screen here. Okay. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
All good.
All right, so one thing I wanted to touch upon getting into the subject about trees and what to do with your landscape is just the subject of climate change. I'm sure everyone has had a general introduction to what the subject is and why we are the way, why we are where we are with our climate today, but I just want to hit on some important topics I thought were very critical for everyone to understand. Two of those being climate and weather and how they are different from each other. Weather reflects short-term conditions of the atmosphere, and climate is the average daily weather for an extended period of time at a certain location. And so keeping this in mind, one can understand that weather will change from minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, week to week, but climate is the average of weather over time and space. And this will be something else important to understand the significance between climate change and global warming as well, because they're not quite the same thing. And in both cases, terms can kind of get muddled. So it's important to remember weather is just more of the shorter period of time, like the snow that we've had recently, where climate is more of the overall season that we have, or the overall dynamic that we have in our ecosystem. And when it comes to climate events, this will include events like volcanic eruptions, sun radiation, things of that kind of nature. Those events can change climates, and they can change weather for periods of time. But also human activity will contribute changes, which many of us would know. A prime example is the Industrial Revolution, with the creation of mechanized factories, coal-fired power plants. things of that nature, we as humanity ended up reaching a level of resource consumption that was never before seen, and our production for manufacturing skyrocketed compared to previous industries. But because of that, as a result, we had immense amounts of pollution and a lot of waste. So things like that on a big scale can certainly contribute a lot to changing our climatic conditions. And so I want to talk about a couple aspects of climate change: atmospheric and temperature aspects, the frequency of extreme weather events, as well as soil issues and how they pertain to trees. There's a lot of greenhouse gases that naturally exist. Greenhouse gases, for anyone who's not familiar, being gases that naturally or unnaturally exist in our atmosphere and have a tendency to end up maintaining a level of heat in our atmosphere by reducing the amount of sun radiation that is reflected off of the Earth's surface and out of our atmosphere, out of the planet. So greenhouse gases that naturally exist are things like carbon dioxide, water vapor, methane, and nitrous oxide. And as I said, they help keep us warm for the fact that they do trap some of the sun's radiation, and that radiation contains heat. So if we did not have any of the naturally occurring gases, we might be more like a frozen planet, like many in our solar system that are beyond our area of orbit. There are some that are man-made though, like chlorofluorocarbons, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. Overall, carbon dioxide has the greatest impact, and it needs more reduction efforts from humans than what we currently have. And this is just a graphic showing the overall change of global carbon emissions from fossil fuels from 1900 to 2014. And this is just an average of data that was collected from this time frame. But as you can see, the bottom is time, the bottom axis is time, the side shows you the level of millions of metric tons of carbon, and it started steadily increasing from 1900. And then once it hit 1950, after World War II, when there were a lot more factories being produced and a lot of goods being consumed and produced, and the globalization of the world economy started to exponentially increase, and it continues to increase to this day. So you can see clearly this is on an upward trend, and that's not something that we want. And it takes changes in our society to combat that. So as I said, global atmospheric carbon rates have steadily increased since 1900, and the top emitters are China at 30%, the United States at 15%, the European Union at 9%, India at 7%, Russia at 5%, and Japan at 4%. Fossil fuel consumption and industrial processes account for 78% of all emissions that are collected from 1970 to 2011. And so this is important to keep in mind as far as actions that we all have as individuals, as consumers, things that truly have a larger impact than others, but also with that data of who are the largest emitters, understanding that we have a contractual obligation and a role to play in changing how things are in our world and our environment. So that being said, the fossil fuel consumption and the processes account for most of the emissions, but also agriculture, forestry, and other land use is the second largest contributor. So there's two things to keep in mind. This is a graphic that shows the global carbon dioxide emissions from specifically fossil fuel combustion and some industrial processes. So this is just kind of outlining what I had laid out in that previous slide, given percentages of who is responsible country by country for emissions. Changes in land use are something that we can do as nations and as a society to help offset carbon dioxide emissions through carbon sequestration. For anyone who's not familiar with that, carbon sequestration is the process of storing and capturing atmospheric carbon through geologic or biologic means. Geologic means of doing so would usually involve injecting carbon dioxide deep into geologic formations to be trapped in rock formations below bedrock, for an extended period of time, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense given the fact that if it was to be released at a certain point in time, that would be a large amount going back into the atmosphere after we have already spent the time and money and effort to put it down in the ground. Biologic means are something that's a lot more common and certainly more of a sustainable approach. And those means, being biologic, would involve us storing carbon dioxide in vegetation, woody biomass, soils, and aquatic environments, primarily through promoting plant growth. So this could be something like, for example, changing a dairy farm or a surface mine or an old factory site into a productive forest ecosystem or a aquatic, terrestrial mixed environment sort of thing, like a wetland area. And through doing that different land use, we would promote plant growth of trees and other sorts of plants, moss, algae, whatever type of plant that would be suitable for that environment, to be able to end up taking carbon dioxide out of the ecosystem and storing it within its own self, because the way that plants work, it's something that has been proven to be useful. And I just want to show you this graphic kind of laying out what I'm talking about as far as a carbon cycle. So I know some of the font is a little small, so I'll try and just explain this as best I can. So you have a map here showing different ecosystems in a landscape. And you have the coast to the left, you have an estuary, sort of the open mouth of water that is coming from lakes and rivers and wetlands through the landscape. You have grasslands and shrublands. And then you have some human involvement in the land, including a impoundment, which I think that means just like a stormwater storage system or some sort of man-made lake. And you have croplands, and you also have a forest fire up at the top. But the carbon pools that you would see in here, which is kind of what I'm getting at, is living biomass, which is in forests and other sorts of plants and woody vegetation. There's dead organic matter. So when a tree dies or falls down in a forest, there's still carbon trapped in the tree itself, as opposed to if this was injected into the bedrock and it came out. There's also salts in the ground, harvested wood, lake reservoir or coastal ocean sediment. And all of these different things combined will be able to consume a large amount of carbon dioxide that might otherwise be in the atmosphere. So this is kind of what I'm getting at as far as a land use change and what we could do through biologic means. So to move on to temperature, just overall statistics that have been seen in the recent years have shown us that we have an increase in the heating and cooling days, meaning that we have an increase in really hot days and an increase in very cold days at the same time. We also have increased global mean temperatures over the entirety of Earth. We also have an increase in the Earth's average surface temperature, meaning just what it consistently hits throughout the year. And since 1976, we have seen a rate of increase that is 3 times faster than the century scale trend, which is pretty alarming. And to top that off, 6 of the past 10 warmest years on record have been since 1998. So those are not very good statistics at all. And this is just a graph to show the global temperature overall and its trends since 1901 to 2000. So this is just showing, like I said, temperature taken from throughout the world and averaged out just to see what the average sort of area that we are in. And you could see before 1900, a little bit colder weather. It's natural to have some changes and fluctuations, but then it starts to go up. This is basically, if you know, during the Industrial Revolution, and then during World War II, it starts to spike up and starts to go down a little bit. And then after 1970, around 1980, it very dramatically increases to hit where we are now. When we see warming that's in conjunction with global warming, as far as the temperatures go, it's something that won't be evenly distributed across the globe. And this is something that I think of whenever I hear people say, oh, well, we just had a bunch of snow yesterday or earlier this week and it's really cold. I don't believe in global warming. Usually people are kind of joking, but that's something there to really keep in mind, is the fact that even though there's a lot of discussion between world governments, different environmental agencies, and private companies about what to do and where we are, just because you might not feel warm and people are talking about global warming doesn't mean that you aren't being that doesn't exist. You know, you might not be affected the same way that someone would in different parts of the world. But one thing to keep in mind is that land masses will get more heating than the oceans, because oceans are able to reflect sunlight off of themselves back into the atmosphere, and land masses absorb more of it. And one thing that we have noticed is that the poles will get the most of the heating. So there's certain areas where a lot of people might not be living currently, or we certainly all aren't living, but that doesn't mean that the changes that we're seeing in global warming aren't happening right now and changing our world as we speak. And one concept I wanted to introduce before I get to the next slide is the urban heat island effect. And this is just kind of shows the whole dynamic of the way that temperature changes affect human populations. And so this is named because what happens when we have, a good example would be during the summer in Chicago. You have the sun beating down. It's like July or August. It's really hot out. You have a huge sprawling city that has lots of impervious surfaces, lots of blacktop, asphalt, dark colored building materials, and they're all very close together, and you don't have as much vegetation. So because of this reason, you're going to have the surfaces of that city and just the city and landmass in general absorb more heat than it would in a rural area. Rural areas that have more vegetation will absorb less heat. And not only that, but you have less ground storage of rainfall in a city. And so there's not as much soil moisture that would help to regulate temperature on the ground. You also have less cooling from evaporation and plant transpiration. So all these combined will make a temperature difference of, it could depend on the day, but it could be like 5, it could be sometimes 10 degrees. I'm sure everyone who's listening to this right now has seen a noticeable difference if you are in a large city versus a suburban area or a rural area during a really hot summer day. So with that in mind, that just goes to show that global warming, climate change, these affect people very differently, even groups of people that live in a relatively close distance from each other. And we have increasing numbers of people living in urban areas, so this will affect more and more people over time as these trends continue, if they aren't stopped, if we don't do anything to try and change the path that we're on. And so with that in mind, I wanted to mention mitigation measures, which bring us to our main topic here as far as trees go. If you increase tree canopy cover, you have things like green roofs, and you have cool roofs or pavements that reflect more sunlight. Those are things that can be actively done in a city to try to change the temperature impacts that we're seeing from global warming. And so planting lots of trees certainly do help. It's not a silver bullet, but that's one thing that we can all use trees for. And when it comes to weather, we have more frequent and more intense weather events. That's something that we have seen in this area, certainly over the past few years, as far as fluctuations from hot droughts, hot, dry summers, really perhaps not large snowfalls overall for an entire winter, but more intense events, intermittently really wet springs, and then getting droughts again, kind of alternating year after year. So a lot of these weather events, as I've mentioned, they're exhibited by more single day extreme precipitation events. And some examples would be the 2020 hurricane season. If I'm not mistaken, I think the people who are responsible for naming hurricanes ran out of names to give them, so they just started going with Greek letters as opposed to just giving them a first name as they would traditionally do. That's how, you know, how many hurricanes that there were. It was unseen before. There's a 2020 local derecho windstorm that happened here in the DuPage County area. Lombard particularly got hit pretty hard. I myself am employed by the village of Lombard on their forestry crew, and we were dealing with storm damage for about a whole month just from a tornado, which also almost never hits this area. There's also been recent flooding in 2020 in Michigan and Appalachia. And on the flip side, these aren't all crazy weather events that happen that involve rain necessarily. It can be things like the Western United States droughts that we have been seeing in recent years, the 2020 wildfire season in the Western US and Australia, and also just mild winters overall. But we seem to still have the possibility for polar vortex events. There was one that was, I think, 3 years ago in the Great Lakes area. So like I mentioned, multiple types of extreme weather events have become more frequent, and each event has negative consequences. You have things like crop damage, tree damage, property and infrastructure damage, ecosystem damage, loss of humans and animals, harm or death done to them, and you have pollution in the air, surface, and water. And this can happen from a tornado going through Iowa and destroying a lot of crops, floods, wildfires, burning cities. I mean, we've seen a lot of crazy things happen the past few years. So I think everyone's able to use their imagination. Moving on to soils, changes that we'll see in soils from climate change will affect physical properties and structure due to temperature and precipitation shifts. These will be things kind of like desertification, where a landmass will begin to slowly change into a desert from a previously semi-arid climate. So this is something that might be seen in California. It's currently witnessed in the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Central Asia. There's also erosion and sedimentation, soil particles being removed from an existing landscape and be transported into waterways and brought downstream. And also greenhouse gases that are trapped in boreal soils, which are in in our case, in the Northern Hemisphere, far north climates like boreal tundra areas in far northern Canada and Russia. Those are areas that have a layer in the soil called permafrost, which is pretty much a permanent frosted area in the soil that, because of climate conditions, have remained that way. And there are gases that are trapped underneath that are beginning to be released as permafrost melts. So another bit about what we're seeing with weather is that we've had an increase in hurricanes in frequency, intensity, and duration. We have ice storms, which we don't really see a lot here in the Chicago area, but we're still prone to seeing it. We have lightning ground strikes, and we have thunderstorm winds. So some of these I've mentioned before, but trying to bring it back to trees. On top of the consequences that we have with climate change and its effects on human populations, we have these types of weather events that can directly affect trees. And this is something that you want to factor in when it comes to a piece of property that you own, like your home, or if you have other real estate property or whatnot. If you have even just a plot of land that has trees, this is something that you want to factor into the long-term survival of any sort of tree population you might be responsible for, but also what you might look to be putting on the ground in the future. Another thing in relation to weather with trees is that we're seeing a growing season expansion, which might sound like a good thing, but it's not necessarily the best thing for us in this area. Typically, the growing season for trees will begin once the last frost has occurred and buds begin to break and leaves begin to open up, and then they expand over the summer, and then they start to dry up, and in the case of broadleaf trees, dry up and fall off the trees when it starts to get cold again. But with the changes in temperature that we see now, we have an extreme frost event increase, like ice storms, that can do damage to the trees by loading lots of extra weight onto branches. and cold tolerance of trees in temperate zones where we are currently here in Chicago and a lot of other areas in the northern US, we're losing the cold tolerance a month sooner, meaning that as temperatures warm up, the trees that are on certain trees that have a native zone in our area, depending on where they are, if this is a northern area of where they're native to or southern, that can dictate if these trees can survive or not based off of what they've adapted to over thousands of years. And so when we have these winter problems of freezing and thawing, we also can run into issues with bud break. And that's when a tree will have its dormant bud that has the leaves developed in a younger stage to be opened up and to produce chlorophyll, which is energy for the plants. Those will break, but that breaking is completely just factors of temperature and of daylight. So if we have fluctuations with temperature where it gets unseasonably warm, trees might be tricked into breaking their buds open, and then we'll have frost and ice and things like that, colder temperatures that will kill the buds. And once the bud is gone, that is it for that leaf. So that tree has already put a lot of resources into that bud, hoping that it'll then open in the spring and open up further when there's more sunlight and develop chlorophyll and feed the tree so that it has more resources again to put on more growth. So you can see this is a huge issue. This can make a slow downward spiral for the health of a tree. Another thing too is plants can also blossom before pollinators have hatched, which impacts plant reproduction. If the flowers are in bloom and there's no pollinators to pollinate them and the flowers only last for maybe a week or two, the timing isn't quite right. This can have a huge impact, not only on just the tree's health, but also crops, for example. In addition to what I've already said, weather changes can also impact tree pests, which include insects and then diseases. Warmer winter temperatures can allow for higher survivability of these pests. So a good example will be like the emerald ash borer. It's kind of run its course through this area of the country, but there are still some ash trees. There certainly still is emerald ash borer in this area. If you try and think of it in the case of that example, if you have warmer winter temperatures, you'll have more of those larvae surviving over the winter and being able to infest other trees the next year. And so because of this, you have an increase in their populations and they'll spread further. And so you'll have more trees dying as a result. So this brings me to the main topic of the presentation, which is trees and what we can really do when it comes to moving forward and trying to plant trees. So one thing that's critical is finding the right tree for the right place. And by doing that, you need to look at the tree species that you're interested in or that you're capable of putting on your property and look at their native zone and their temperature climate change projection. And what I mean by this is looking at the characteristics of the tree, because not all trees that you can plant in this area can necessarily survive the different weather conditions that might be thrown at it, or something that you might be able to buy from some sort of nursery or big box store might not really be suitable. So we need to start planting trees that have the following characteristics. We need trees that are adapted to warmer temperatures so that over time, as the temperatures change, it'll be kind of looking a step ahead and planning for the long run, and planting a tree that might be already occurring in this area of the US, but maybe we're on closer to the northern edge of its species range. And so the species ranges will move further north as the temperatures increase, meaning that this tree might not be seen a whole lot in the area, but will be certainly adapted to increasing temperatures. We also need to be planting trees that are able to handle poorly drained soils. And one example I put in here is Colorado blue spruce. That's a tree that's very common in landscaping. It's very beautiful. It's a coniferous evergreen tree, meaning it's cone bearing and it keeps its leaves, which are needles, on all year round. And they have a really striking sort of dusty light blue tinge to the needles. The problem with these trees is that a lot of people like to mix and match evergreens and deciduous trees in their landscape, but with these trees, they're native to the Rocky Mountain area in Colorado. And they're adapted to a soil whose pH is very different than our soil. It's a rocky, very dry, well-drained, mountainous soil. And we here in Illinois live where we have very poorly drained clay soils. And I've seen lots of blue spruce in recent years that have ended up getting stunted growth, having some root rot, and then croaking because of the repetitive hot summers, somewhat mild winters at times, really wet springs. So this is what I mean when I'm saying trees that are able to handle poorly drained soils, what we typically have here. So you don't, just because those trees can grow here, because they certainly can, doesn't mean that that's something that you should look to be planting anytime that you think about what you want to do with your landscape. You also want to have species that enhance local diversity. So you don't want to have the same tree as your neighbor. You don't want to have the same tree as what you see down the block. You also want to have species that are disease resistant and have no invasive pests. So species characteristics are key. They all have advantages and limitations, and there's not one specific one that's bad, but some come with lots of issues. An example is Bradford calorie pear. I'm going to show a picture in the next slide of this, but they have a nice shape. They have green foliage. They have good fall color, white spring flowers, but they have a bad tendency to split under ice and snow loads due to weak branch union. So they're sold very heavily at nurseries, but they're one tree I'd say that you'd want to avoid. So this slide's just showing you the example of a Bradford pear in springtime. It has a really nice shape, beautiful white flowers. It makes sense why people would want to plant this. And then on the right, you have this huge gap in the canopy from a loss of limbs due to ice and snow loading. When you're looking at the site that you have and the tree that you want to look at the space that you have, what you have above ground, below ground for the root growth, to the side. You want to see if there's going to be any utilities issues, what kind of exposure that the tree will have to sun and wind, and the winter hardiness level that the tree is rated at, as well as what our winters look like. Like you don't want to have a very weak tree or a tree that's susceptible to salt be exposed to road salts in the winter in this area. An example would be like an oaks. Oaks don't really do very well if you live on a main street or somewhere that's going to have repetitive salt for de-icing in the winter. And you also want to look at the factors of your own soil. You want to see what the pH is, if it's alkaline or if it's acidic. What's the texture and the structure of the soil? What's the general moisture, and what's the soil biology like? If there's any sorts of layers of organic matter or microorganisms that are living in the soil. In some cases, you can plant pest-resistant cultivars or species. And an example of this would be the resistant elm species that the Morton Arboretum has put out in recent decades as an alternative to planting American elm, because these resistant varieties are resistant to Dutch elm disease. And when they're available, these can greatly reduce maintenance costs and care for them, but unfortunately not in every case are those alternatives available. Another tree quality that you want to look at is the planting stock. And by that, I mean just this general structure of a tree when you get it in a nursery. Trees of poor structure will become a future liability, and more is not necessarily better. This picture makes a really good example of that, because you have a cluster of branches all at the same area on the tree. That's not good, because they will all continue to grow at the same time, and they'll end up having a weak branch attachment. And if you have one or multiple of those fall off because of a storm, you're gonna have a huge hole where the rest of those are at the same spot, and that'd be a place for decay and rot to set in. And that's not good when you have all the rest of your branches attached to that same area. one really important thing to keep in mind is the planting stock size. Smaller trees are trees that establish faster, and the Morton Arboretum did a study not too long ago showing this. So this is a picture taken from the study, and they planted two trees, one that was larger, one that was smaller, and they did it at the same time. And the smaller tree lapsed the growth of the initially larger tree. And the reason is because when you have a larger tree, when you transplant that from the nursery, you have a larger amount of root mass to cut up when you have to package a tree for transport. And when you put that in the ground, you have more of that area removed, and trees go into a process called transplant shock. And they need to use all of their energy to reproduce the roots that were removed. And then only till the roots are removed will they be able to put above ground growth onto the tree. And so that's why it's important. A lot of people like to look for a larger tree to put in the ground because they want something big now, but I'm telling you, it's not worth it. You will always end up with a better, healthier, sturdier tree if you go with a smaller one. So just keep that in mind. This is just an image to show incorrect and correct tree planting techniques. The text is really dense, so I'm just going to go through it really quick in the next slide, but I just wanted to show you that the images, and there's a couple key things to take away from this here. So just keep those in mind as I'm going through these next points. You want to have a wide, shallow hole. You don't want to have something that's too narrow or too deep or too high. You want to have a properly depthed hole. You want to have a firm bottom so that the soil doesn't cave in after you put the tree in. You want to have the first order roots at the surface, meaning that wherever the roots begin flaring out of the trunk, that is the level of depth you want the tree at. If you can, it'd be helpful to have the orientation of the trunk the way it was in the nursery. So if possible, the north side of the trunk is going to face the north side of your property, just because that's the way the individual tree has been growing. You want to remove any burlap, bast rungs, or twine from the top of the ball so that it doesn't choke out the tree as it starts to develop growth. And you also want to backfill the hole with the original soil to keep everything consistent as far as drainage and nutrient availability. You don't want to stake your tree unless you have to. And you also want to mulch the surface of the tree to the drip line, which is where the canopy would basically end if you were to draw a circle around the tree at a bird's eye view. Drip line is where rainwater will end up dripping through the canopy and where that line ends. You'll only want to prune off dead or broken branches. You don't want to be removing any sorts of other branches when you put the tree in, because it needs to be getting as much energy as it possibly can. And you just want to do consistent supplemental watering when needed during the growth season for the first few years. You don't want to use any fertilizer. And I have two links for some resources that will be really helpful for homeowners when it comes to trees. I didn't really name any specific species in here as far as what to put where, because it's all dependent on where the site is and what soil you have and what the site conditions are. But this first link is the Northern Illinois Tree Selector and the Tree Plant Finder links. If you go to that website, there'll be a whole option of different options in a menu rather. And those are two that I would highly suggest people look at, because it has information regarding species selection and planting for your property. You can put in a query as far as different selected attributes that you have that you might be relevant to where you live, and then it'll pull up species that are going to fit the area's needs. And on top of that, you also have the second link, which is a great resource for homeowner tree selection and care. It covers subjects in great detail and has very specific info regarding tree species. So if that's something that you need, pull this slideshow back up at some point in time and get those links and go to those websites. When it comes to our congregation, a plan that the environmental committee is working on is creating a tree inventory so that we have an existing database for the trees that are on the property. And this will be something that has always been managed and maintained, but it'll be able to be utilized so that with our existing urban forest that is around the temple, can move forward to adapt to changes in our environment, and we can plant new trees with species diversity and with climate change in mind, even better than we have in the past. I just want to close it out with the fact that trees are an investment for the future. And so that's something that we should always be looking at is looking towards what direction that we're heading, because the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. And that is the presentation. So that's it. It looks like I have a couple questions in the chat box, so I'll just answer these really quickly. The first one is, so what is our role? What do you think that we should do? One thing I think that we should all do is where we have space to plant trees, we should be attempting to plant as many as we can to increase canopy cover. Whether that's your home or some sort of community group that you're involved with, wherever you have the opportunity, doing that, doing volunteer tree planting events, or even just kind of promoting this whole idea of increasing tree populations where we live, whether it's something that you're capable of doing, by hand, or something that you can go out and talk to people about. I think that's what we can all do. And there will be future tree planting events with the temple. I don't know about any coming up soon. We're trying to plan for some in the spring, but just for the record, anyone who is interested in that, that's something that the environmental committee will be putting more information out. Rick asked, what are green roofs and what are cool roofs? So if you remember from the urban heat island slide I was talking about, green roofs are roofs that have green infrastructure on them, meaning it could be like some sort of cool upscale bars and restaurants have these in the city, but it's something you commonly see where there's planting beds on a rooftop and there's maybe herbs or ornamental plants or even trees. That's like a green roof, a roof that is capable of taking in stormwater and producing oxygen instead of carbon dioxide. And a cool roof is something that might be a bit more reflective than an absorbent of sunlight. So it could be a roof tile material that's white instead of black, or it could be glass instead of a conventional material, something like that. Another question was, should we still consider ourselves a zone 5? I have a Colorado blue spruce. What can I do to keep it healthy? I do believe we are a zone 5. If you are in Chicago, I think actually if you're in DuPage County, it's slightly a different zone. I think partially because of the heat island effect. And so the blue spruces, they certainly can grow and get healthy in this area. I've seen many mature ones, but it just seems that they're susceptible to having a lot of root issues that that would not otherwise happen if they weren't living in this area. So my recommendation would be just to make sure that it is in a site that's remains well drained. If it's a completely mature tree, there's not much you can do. Like, you're not going to move that tree or anything. So just give it some regular healthy mulching. Certainly don't water it, because I don't think it would need any extra water than what it gets in this area. And prune off any dead or dying branches over time. And then it looks like the last question was, it will be great if we can have the information about tree installation and a few other slides available on the temple website. So those links I mentioned, just to make it easy for everyone, I can get those listed myself, and I can give that to either the rabbis or maybe the environmental committee, and we can find a way to provide those links on the website of the temple for everyone to be able to have quick access to.
That sounds wonderful, and I think on behalf of the whole environmental committee, and of course Congregation against Chaim, and Rabbi Kostowski as well, really thanking you, for coming and giving us this wonderful presentation, Sam. And so what I'll do, I guess, if we want, we can even unmute. Although if we were in person, I know you would get lots of claps. But thank you so much, for being and telling us, these really important but wonderful things that you've told us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and sharing what information I have.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you very
Good night.
much.
Good night.
Sam.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot, Sam.
You're welcome.
Scott, thank you, Sam.
Proud of
Thank you.
See you.
This was
Good to see you as well.
Thank you,
Good seeing you.
Sam.
And if you want to
Thank
rewatch
you.
the
Nice seeing you.
presentation, we'll get it up on our
Stay
YouTube
safe.
page very soon.
Good
Okay.
job.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
especially
Bye-bye.
the links.
Oh,
That would be great.
food.
Yes.
Thank you,
Thank you.
environmental.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
All right, have a good night.
Bye-bye.
You too.
Happy
Good
Tuber.
night.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can get those